I see that it's 6 o'clock, so let's get started. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Our gracious Father, once again, we thank you that you've given us this time. And I just ask that you would speak to us, teach us during these moments. And I just pray that all glory would go to you. So lead us and guide us in our conversations, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I have more slides today than I've had in any of the previous lectures, so I need to move quickly. But today we want to talk about the underwater basilica at Nicaea. Next week I will be in San Diego. I will make a presentation at the American Academy of Religion, Society of Biblical Literature, Evangelical Theological Society, and the Society, or I should say the Biblical Archeology Society. I will be sharing some of this information with them as well. So next week, next Sunday, we will not meet. But the Sunday after, we will gather together once again. So just so you know what the schedule is like. Okay, I was selected in 2022 to work with Mustafa Shaheen. I received a Fulbright Senior Scholar research grant. Shaheen is a Turkish archaeologist, and actually I had been working with him since 2017. But the Fulbright gave me an opportunity to spend more time and gave me the resources that I could be more fully involved. Back in 2014, aerial photography over Lake Iznik saw what you see here. This is actually my photograph with my drone, but they discovered a structure submerged in the waters about 50 yards offshore. Northwest corner of Turkey. The city there that you can see called Byzantium. Okay, that's the Byzantine city, which later was named after Constantine, became known as Constantinople. Today it's known as Istanbul. You'll notice that to the north of Byzantium is the Black Sea. But if you drop down then, a little bit to the south, you see an inland lake there, in Nicaea there, Nicaea. That is where this lake is, and it's the ancient city. Today it's called Iznik, but in the past was known as Nicaea. This is another map that once again shows you the Black Sea to the north. You can see the Bosphorus. Once again shows you the Black Sea to the north. You can see the Bosphorus, that channel of water that we talked about actually several lectures ago, talking about some of the discoveries up in the Black Sea. And at the south end of the Bosphorus there, that's where Istanbul is located. And if you look over to the lower right-hand corner, that is Lake Iznik. In the past, during New Testament days, that was called Lake Iskania. Now, the question that's probably emerged in your mind is, why is this basilica underwater? Well, they certainly didn't build it underwater. But what we discover is that Turkey is on what is called the Anatolian Plate. This is a tectonic plate which seismologists describe as the world's most active seismic plate. There are earthquakes quite frequently in Turkey. And you can see the blue line over on the right-hand side called the East Anatolian Fault Line. That's where a year and a half ago some terrible, terrible earthquakes took place. And the destruction at Antakya, ancient Antioch, which is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, was just catastrophic. 50,000 people killed. And that was just one of the movements. Now, the plate that we're more, or I should say the fault line that we're more interested in is the yellow fault line along the north, that is south of the Black Sea, along the northern mountains of Turkey. That's called the Northern Anatolian Fault Line. And if you go all the way to the west, that is the left on our map here, you see it branches into three different sections. With this, you can see those three different sections, and you'll notice that the middle section runs directly through Nicaea and the lake that we're talking about. One more photograph, a little bit closer. This is Lake Iznik, ancient Asconia, and you can see the red line all the way to the bottom. That is the fault line for Lake Iznik. Now, how destructive are these earthquakes and these faults? Well, this is a recent photograph of the earthquakes that took place in Antakya, and you'll notice how, if I zoom in, you see those three specks up in the upper left-hand corner? Those are people, just to give you some perspective in terms of how much the earth moved during this recent earthquake in eastern part of Turkey. So we're talking about some significant seismic activity. This is a chart plotting the region, northwestern part of Turkey, where earthquakes have taken place over the last 2,000 years. And you can see the larger dots are earthquakes that were 7.0 or higher, and the smaller dots are 6.0, between 6 and 7 in terms of the Richter scale. So again, a lot of earthquakes in this region. Moving right along, this is a shot with my drone. This is the modern city of Iznik, civ walls that you can see in Diyarbakir. These are the equal. The walls are punctuated with gates. This is the eastern gate that's called the Lefki Gate. It's a series of 3 gates, one inside of the other. The earliest gate, of course, was constructed as a victory arch for the Emperor Vespasian near the latter part of the 1st century. Here's another shot of that same gate complex, the Lefki Gate. And then if we go to the north, this is the Istanbul Gate leading to Istanbul. Likewise, it is a series of 3 walls, one inside of the other. And again, the earliest wall, or I should say the earliest gate, was originally constructed as a victory arch by Vespasian. Another shot, and yet another shot of the gate complex. Elsewhere in the city of Nicaea, of course, the modern city covers up much of the ancient city, and you can't tear down buildings, you can't rip up streets, things of that sort, so you can't see as much as you'd like to see if the place was actually vacated. But here, 10 feet below the modern city streets, you can see the ancient Roman street, just a portion of it. Here is one of the walls, I should say the walls and towers. There are 114 towers. These walls go out and around the city for a distance of 3 miles. You can see that's me standing on the top of this wall in this tower. The walls are about 13 feet. They average about 13 feet in thickness and are somewhere between 33 and 43 feet in height. And like I say, quite impressive walls. If for no other reason, go to Nicaea to see the walls. They are really impressive. Now, my research centered around 3 questions. The first question was this structure, this underwater structure, originally a temple dedicated to Apollo? That's what the director of excavations, Mustafa Shaheen, believes, that it began as a temple dedicated to Apollo. I question that. Number 2, was the structure originally a martyrion dedicated to Neophutos? We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the third question was this structure a basilica where the Council of Nicaea met? Now, some of you may know a little bit about the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was the first ecumenical council where Christians across the Mediterranean world, which in effect was worldwide, that's as far as Christianity had spread at that point, were gathered together in the city of Nicaea to debate issues. And this was a very important moment in Christian history. There's a lot of misunderstandings of what actually happened at the Council of Nicaea. We don't have enough time to talk about that today. Maybe on another occasion, if you corner me, we can talk about what was actually going on. But of course, the Nicene Creed, most of you are familiar with the Nicene Creed, was issued at this time. So let's address that first question. Was this temple originally a temple dedicated to the god Apollo? This is a drawing by Mustafa Shaheen, director of excavations, and he believes that it originated like this as a 6 by 11 paraptal temple with 2 columns set in antis in front and in back. That basically means that we've got columns surrounding the temple. Now there's problems with this. As much as Mustafa has been excavating for the last 9 years, he has found, and this is a quote from him, "No architectural remains of this temple have been identified so far." He's found nothing to confirm this. Okay, and the bigger problem in my estimation is there's no crepidoma or stylobate. Now the crepidoma and stylobate would be the flat platform, okay, upon which you erect the temple. There's none of it. What we find below is beach rock, basically the foundation in the solidification or the concretation of rock below the lake. So that immediately raises some flags in wonder of whether or not this was ever a temple. Okay, what he also believes is that later in time, a martyr, and Mustafa Shaheen identifies that martyr as Neophutos, was buried in the temple. Now again, there's some problems here, okay? Would Christians want a patron saint, a martyr, to be buried in an active pagan temple? This temple was still operating at that time. And then the other side of the coin is, would the priests of a pagan temple allow a Christian who objected to paganism to be buried in their temple? Seems unlikely to me, okay? The next stage, according to Mustafa Shaheen, is that the green interior walls were constructed near the end of the 4th century, okay? This would have converted the exterior walls, that is the black parts, because secondary construction, which would have taken place 200 years later, should be evident in the construction. Well, this is what we see. I don't know how much closer I need to zoom in, but that's where the interior walls connect with the exterior walls. And what you can see here is that the joint here was integrated and interlaced with the exterior wall. In other words, they were built at the same time. This is not secondary construction. I've got another shot from the side. This is the same seam where the interior wall connects with the exterior wall. And again, you can see that the construction is the same. In other words, this was all constructed at the same time. Likewise, if we go to the eastern part of the basilica, again, let me zoom in. You can see here where the interior wall is connected with the exterior wall of the supposed temple. And you can see again, the stone pieces are interlaced with one another, indicating that this was original construction, not secondary construction. Okay, you'll notice the yellow sprinkled all over the place on this drawing. These are tombs. There were 36 tombs found in and around the basilica. Actually, it's evenly divided. 18 of them are inside of the basilica. Another 18 of them are on the outside of the basilica. Problem, okay, is this was common practice for Christians, even in more recent, churches that were built 1,500 years later. People were buried in the church. So very common. And the reason for that is early Christians believed that the holiness and the power of the saint would spill over into those who were buried nearby. Now, it's not the case, but that was the belief. They wanted to be buried near a martyr or a saint. And so as a consequence, you see a concentration of these tombs in the church and surrounding the church. Now, on the other hand, nobody was buried in a pagan temple. Nobody. Not even the priests were buried in a pagan temple. See, the pagan temple was the house of the deity, and a corpse would defile the house of the deity. So this was nothing that you would see in any of these pagan temples. This is a shot. This is not my photograph. This is one of Professor Shaheen's photographs. And what you see are these are three of the tombs. They're marked KM, which stands for ceramic mezar. Mezar is a Turkish term for a tomb. And what's important to note is also, let me zoom in a little bit closer here, you can see, some of these tombs are actually under the wall. Okay, under the wall of what is called the bema. The bema wall, of course, would be at the front of the church. More shots of some of these terracotta ceramic tombs. Again, another shot where you can see some of these tombs are underneath that wall. They found skeletal remains in some of these ceramic tombs. One of these tombs, the skeletal remains, were taken for radiocarbon dating, and these were found to be dated between 335 and 418 AD. So you get this range. We can't really be more precise than that. A range of when these persons were buried. More skeletal remains at some of the tombs. Later, as the walls began to, or I should say, as the waters began to encroach upon the basilica, a perimeter wall was constructed to try and keep the waters away. Now, this probably happened, of course, over time. Probably wasn't just one earthquake that had caused the ground to shift, but probably sequentially. So as a consequence, this church, this basilica, was considered important enough that they constructed a perimeter wall to try and keep the waters away. Eventually, of course, that failed, okay, and the church was abandoned. If we look up to the front of the church, which is the eastern part of the church, you can see in the center there, the semicircular, what is called an apse. And then over onto the right-hand side, we have what is called the diaconicon. And there was another little structure with a small little apse, as you can see. Let me zoom in on that a bit. And there was a sarcophagus. A sarcophagus is a tomb, a stone tomb that was placed in that structure. This is probably where the saint or the martyr was interred, was buried. After the church was abandoned, or probably at some time prior to the church being abandoned, the relics and the sarcophagus of this tomb were extracted or taken out of this basilica and then relocated to the Koimesis church, which was in Nicaea. Now let's talk about the martyr. We don't know for sure who the martyr was because there's not a whole lot of information about martyrs during that period of time. We have about a half dozen names of possibilities of who could have been martyred here, who could have been buried here. Mustafa Shaheen believes it was a fellow by the name of Neophutos. What you see here is a menologion. This is called the Menologion of Basil II. Basil II was the Byzantine emperor at Constantinople, and he had his subjects create this menologion. Basically, a menologion is a calendar, and for each day of the calendar, there is a saint who is commemorated and remembered on that particular day. One of these panels contains the story of Neophutos. What you see here is the menologion that is currently in the Walters Museum in Baltimore, who incidentally lost in their football game with the Steelers today. And it's dated to the 10th or 11th century. The illustrated panel tells the story. Well, the text tells the story, but the illustrated panel also shows Neophutos being martyred, killed in Nicaea. We did a film about the story of the discovery, and the filmmakers took me to the Vatican. This is the Vatican Library, and it's really impressive how they do not want you to touch, because your fingers, of course, have oils on them, which would slowly degrade some of these manuscripts. They also have a manuscript, a Basil II Menologion. This one's dated 50 years earlier, and it's beautiful. It's in great shape, but I also want you to note that there's a difference here. The soldier who is slaying Neophutos is using a sword, whereas earlier he's using a cudgel. That's hard to see there because it's not as well preserved. Also notice that the Walter's Menologion shows Neophutos being slain on the land, but the earlier Vatican Menologion has water there. You see the blue at the bottom of the... Okay? And that's important, okay, because that identifies the place where Neophutos was in fact executed. This is a close-up shot with my drone of the remains that are still underwater. I want you to pay attention to the upper left-hand part of the photo. You can see remains of a sarcophagus, okay, that are still there underwater. Here's perhaps a better photograph. This is not my photograph, but you can see the frame there of the sarcophagus, which was left behind when the sarcophagus was removed. As I'd mentioned to you, the sarcophagus and the remains, the relics of Neophutos, supposedly, according to tradition, were relocated to the Koimesis Church once the underwater basilica was lost to the waters. The problem is the Koimesis Church actually was constructed somewhere between the 6th and 8th century AD, but in the year 1922, the Koimesis Church was intentionally destroyed by Turkish citizens of Nicaea in retaliation for the destruction of a mosque in Greece. During that period of time, okay, there was a lot of animosity, a lot of friction between Greeks and Turkish people. There was a population exchange where many of the Greek people in Turkey were forcibly relocated to Greece, and a lot of the Turkish residents of Greece were forcibly removed and relocated to Turkey. A very turbulent period of time. And as a consequence of these frayed relations, not only was a mosque desecrated, but also the Koimesis Church, unfortunately, was destroyed. We have early evidence of the fact that Neophutos' remains were there at the Koimesis Church, but after its destruction, what's left? Not much. This panel was recovered from the Koimesis Church, and it's believed to be the panel of the sarcophagus. The reason? Because it matches the frame that you see underwater at the submerged church. This is a photo of the back side. This is the front side. This is the back side of the sarcophagus. You can see two large crosses there. That's Mustafa Shaheen, actually, on the right-hand side, and that's his assistant, Suha, who is the assistant director of excavations on the left-hand side, just so you get a picture of them. This is the ambo. The ambo would be the speaker's platform, the place where a person would preach, share the gospel. And then these are the remains of the Koimesis Church, as you can see them in Nicaea today, or Iznik today. Not far away, we have an iasma, and that is a spring, perhaps even a baptistry, perhaps a place where sacred water was dispensed for the Koimesis Church. And it contains what's called spolia, that is secondary use architectural materials. You can see, again, if I zoom in, you can see the far piece has a menorah etched on one side of it. And just below the menorah, you have Psalm 136, verse 25, written in Greek. And then you have a later inscription in much larger print up on top that makes reference to the current basileus, that is the king. Okay, in the year 313 AD, Constantine and Licinius, they were joint, that is, both emperors, rulers of the Roman Empire, one in the west, other on the east. They jointly issued what is called the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan was when Christianity became legal for the first time. Up to that point, Christianity had been persecuted, and the persecutions were sporadic, so it's not like it was unabated from the first century all the way up until the early 4th century. But with the Edict of Milan, Christianity now became a legal religion. Persecutions stopped, and property that previously had been seized was returned to the Christians. Constantine encouraged people to support Christians in the reconstruction of churches. And so beginning in 313 AD, places of worship were constructed. Now, again, many of you may be familiar with Eusebius. Eusebius is one of Christianity's earliest historians. He wrote in the early 4th century. He happened to be a participant in the Council of Nicaea. So this is eyewitness testimony, okay? And what Eusebius tells us is how it is that the people first gathered together when Constantine called together the council. So I'm quoting here, the most eminent servants of God from all the churches that filled Europe, Africa, and Asia, they gathered together, and one place of worship, as if expanded by God, accommodated the people. Now, the council met for 2 months, and they deliberated several matters, okay, and they finally came to the point where they voted on the matter. And so this is what Eusebius says a little bit later in the text. He says, on the day of the council designated to reach a resolution on the disputed issues, everyone was present in the innermost hall of the palace, which appeared to exceed the rest in size. Many rows of seats had been set along the sides of the hall. Those invited arrived, and all took their designated seats. Now, what I want to do is compare these two statements. Up at the top is a statement that Eusebius made when they first gathered together. At the bottom, we have the place where they gathered together at the end of the proceedings, when they voted on the matter and issued the Nicene Creed. I highlight a couple phrases here. Eusebius says they gathered together in one place of worship. Actually, in the Greek text, it's translated a house of prayer. Now, Constantine's palace could not be aptly described as a house of prayer. But that's where they first met. And then, of course, at the end of the proceedings, it's stated that they met in the innermost hall of the palace. So, did they relocate? What I suggest is they first met in the church, but the church was not big enough to accommodate all the people. The Council of Nicaea, and again, the numbers are disputed, but scholars say that there are anywhere between 250 and 318 people who attended. That is bishops. In addition to the bishops, they were allowed to take associates, that is deacons, with them, as many as 4. So we're probably talking about 1,200 people, 1,500 people, okay? Now, probably all of them did not fit into the church. Probably only the bishops, because the church was not big enough to accommodate all these numbers. And that's why Eusebius uses this phrase, one place of worship, as if expanded by God. Gives us the impression that they were squeezed into the structure. They made it as if expanded. Now, the problem with this is they're meeting in the middle of the summer. And I can testify that in the middle of the summer, Turkey gets awfully hot. They didn't have air conditioning back in those days. You can imagine that it would not be a suitable place for them to debate the issues over the next 2 months. So what I suspect happened is that sometime over the course of maybe a week, maybe longer, Constantine simply said, hey, I've got a place that is larger and can accommodate all of them. So I think, and this is what I am suggesting, I think that what has happened is they relocated. They moved to Constantine's palace. And that's why the second phrase that we have, at the time when they voted on the matter, it stated that they met in the innermost hall of the palace. And then again, he makes this statement, which appeared to exceed the rest in size. The impression given is they had plenty of room. Now, we also have another document that I think is important. Early in the 7th century, or perhaps the 8th century, there's another document that's called the Laudation of the 318 Fathers. 318 was the so-called official number of the bishops that gathered together. The leader of the Nicene Church asked Gregory of Caesarea to write this laudation. Now, why did he ask Gregory of Nicaea, or Gregory of Cappadocia, to write this? It's probably because Gregory still had access to the notes of Eusebius. Remember, Eusebius is this historian who was actually there. So Gregory of Caesarea wrote this document, and he also had access to what is called a synodal tome. That is another document which listed the 318 people who were participants. Okay? And this is what we read in the laudation. Having detached from the palace, that is there, a huge hall, the fairest part, as it were, of the imperial apartments, whose decorous beauty has been preserved to our days by the protection of the Holy Fathers. The mighty emperor assigned this hall like an offering of first fruits to the Holy Synod. So the laudation tells us that they met in the palace, right? But there's something else that the laudation says. Okay, the laudation tells us that over the course of the 2 months, 2 of the participants at the Nicene Council passed away. And it stated that Chrysanthus passed, and he was, quote, buried in the church of Nicaea. So there was a church there. See, some scholars today assume that the Council of Nicaea met in the palace, and there never was a church. Some would argue that there wasn't even a church that was constructed at that time. Well, there was plenty of time between the Edict of Milan, 313 AD, and 325. There's plenty of time for a church to have been constructed. But this tells us that there was a church. So Chrysanthus died, was buried in the church of Nicaea. It's also stated that Musonius, another participant, another bishop who had come to the Council of Nicaea, passed away, and it stated that he too was buried in the church. So again, we have a document, okay, that states that there was a church at that time, and that's where they were buried. Now, this became a place of pilgrimage, where there are pilgrim roads, for instance, that lead to Nicaea, and the testimony of people who actually came and pilgrimaged to this site. Now, did they pilgrimage to the Council of Nicaea because it was a martyrion? That is a church that was dedicated to a martyr who was executed. Or did they pilgrimage there because of the Council of Nicaea? We don't know for sure. But in the year 728 AD, Willibrord, a pilgrim from Britain, came to the, quote, church. That's what he describes. So the church evidently was still existent, and this was the church that the residents of Nicaea pointed Willibard to as the place where the Council of Nicaea took place. Likewise, later in the 11th century, Michael Attalales of Constantinople, he described earthquakes that had taken place during the 11th century, and he claims that these earthquakes destroyed the church where the Council of Nicaea met. Among the artifacts that were discovered at Nicaea is this token. This is a terracotta token, so it's of no material value. It's not of gold, it's not of silver, not of copper or bronze. It's clay, okay? But it's a token which indicates that this was a place of pilgrimage. Now the token, and I use this just by way of illustration, this is a coin that's similar to the token, okay? And if you look at the obverse, that in one of my earlier lectures, we talked about dating. And one of the best ways to date is through pottery. Broken pottery called shards, and so there are many shards that have been discovered at the basilica, and this is a chart showing how many pieces there are from different dating periods. So we've got 10 pieces that date somewhere into the 1st century, another 19 pieces that date to the 2nd century, 43 pieces, and this is where the majority of these broken pottery shards are to be dated, and then another 23 in the 4th century, and then it begins to taper off after that into the 5th, 6th, and 7th century. So again, the presence of pottery that dates to the 2nd century and early 4th century suggests that this is the time when most activity was taking place at that site. Likewise, coins have been found. 871 coins. A lot of coins had been found. And this coin, of course, you can see is a coin in the early 4th century of Helena. Helena, of course, is the mother of Constantine. And most of these coins date from either the 2nd century up to the 13th century AD, and most of them from the second half of the 4th century. What is also notable here is that the number of coins that date to after 390 tapers off, drops off significantly, which again tells us that most of the activity of these people that were coming here took place in the 4th century. 2 of these coins were found in the tombs that I had mentioned earlier, okay? The upper one is for the Emperor Valens near the end of the 4th century. The lower one is the coin of the Emperor Valentinian, dating to the, again, end of the 4th century. These were found in the ceramic tomb number 4. Now, what is also important to note is that there's another wall. Okay? Let me zoom in. You see the wall that's in the center that actually crosses the bema wall. You'll notice the bema wall also extends over to the left. Okay? And then that wall is underneath the aisle wall that you see over here on the left-hand side. This is a better representation. This is not my drawing. This is from Mustafa Shaheen. You can see the blue there. You can see that it's a squared structure. That is underneath the black wall. It's also underneath the green wall, which indicates that it preceded the black wall and also preceded the green wall. What could this be? You'll notice that there's a cluster of tombs, okay, inside of that square structure. And so what I'm suggesting is that this was an early shrine. A martyr, perhaps Neophutos, we'll never know for sure who the martyr was martyred here on the shore of Lake Iscania. And thereafter, people came there to remember and to celebrate the life of a saint who died in behalf of the Christian faith. Okay? Many people were buried there. A structure was built out and around that tomb. And then what I suggest is that later on in time, that is after the Edict of Milan. Remember the Edict of Milan dated to 313 AD. Then a wooden basilica was constructed over this site. Now Christianity, with the Edict of Milan, Christianity was allowed to build their own churches. Up to that point, there were no churches. Well, there were actually house churches. People met together in homes. They weren't allowed to build structures with steeples and crosses on them. Now, after the Edict of Milan, they were. Okay? And so what I believe happened here is that that square structure, okay, that shrine, was then encapsulated within a wooden basilica that was constructed. After that, in the latter part of the 4th century, a masonry structure constructed of limestone was what we now see underwater. Wood does not last, right? Wood, of course, is carboniferous, and it, is easily destroyed. But limestone persists. So let me, again, just note, this photograph is perhaps even better. According to the theory currently promoted by Mustafa Shaheen, Director of Excavation, the black part is part of what he believes was a temple of Apollo. Or at least it was built over a temple of Apollo. But he still hasn't discovered any of the remains of that temple of Apollo. Then later, he believes that the green part was constructed over the top of the Apollo temple. At some point, the tomb, that is the yellow, actually I've got the sequence wrong. The black would be first, the yellow would be second, and that would be the time when Neophutos, the martyr, would have been placed within the active Apollo temple. Later in the 4th century, he believes, what happened here? Later, the green was constructed as the temple was converted into a basilica, and then the last part of the construction, according to Mustafa Shaheen, is the blue, which is puzzling because it's underneath the others. Now, one other point that needs to be noted is that Byzantine archaeologists who have studied the conversion of temples into churches have noted that direct conversions did not take place until the middle of the 5th century. This masonry church is dated to the latter part of the 4th century. So again, that is added testimony to the fact that this was never a pagan temple to begin with. It was constructed at the beginning as a martyrion over a shrine that had been constructed earlier. Now you're saying, Fairchild, what evidence do you have that this was constructed of wood? Well, some wood, not much, has been discovered in a well near the narthex of the church. There was a well, and deep down in the well they have discovered portions of wood. They also have discovered charcoal, that is burnt wood, and what they've also discovered are nails, lots of nails. Now, of course, you do not use nails for stone structures. Instead, you use nails for wood. So you have large nails, small nails, just lots of nails, which again is an indication that there was a wood structure there at some point or another. Now, it was common for basilicas to be reconstructed and enlarged. And this is evident in many, many instances. Now, I just give you one example here. Elsewhere in Turkey, in southeast Turkey, there is a church built over the site of Thecla. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Thecla before. Thecla was a early Christian who followed Paul. She's never mentioned anywhere in the New Testament, but there's ample evidence to indicate that Thecla, this woman, converted, became a Christian, and followed Paul for a period of time. She spent her last years at Salifke, and she spent her last years in a cave, which you see depicted here on the right-hand side of the drawing. Okay? After her passing, that cave was converted into a small basilica with columns that were erected to divide a nave into different aisles. Later in time, a masonry constructed church or basilica was built above ground, which you can see in black. And then that was in the 4th century. Then in the 5th century, we had the larger structure, which is in grade hashed out section of an enlarged basilica. So what you see here is 3 different stages of construction. The Martyrion of Thecla was underground to begin with. That was converted then into a small shrine, a small basilica, which was then enlarged in the 4th century with what you see here in the black, and then further enlarged in the 5th century, which you see in the gray. So just to show you this to this and this. Okay, so what I propose, okay, is that the structure began with the blue, that is a shrine. Later, a wooden structure was built to encapsulate or to surround the shrine. Of what size, we don't know. Okay, and then finally, in the late 4th century, we have the masonry construction that you see today underwater. Now, let me just finish then with what about the Palace of Constantine? Has that ever been discovered? The shorter answer is no. It's never been discovered. This wall, which juts out into Lake Iznik, is about 300 feet north of the submerged, not feet, 300 yards north of the basilica. Originally, this was thought to be the remains of Constantine's palace, but scholars today question that. So many of them do not believe it. Instead, they think that this is a continuation of the city wall. If that's not the place, where could it be? Well, I don't know for sure, but I would suggest it may be around here. This is in the north of the city, near the lake. This is west of the Istanbul gate that I showed you. What I am speculating, and I won't put a whole lot of money on it, but if anywhere, it's probably in this area where the palace once existed. In support of that, we also have an inscription, and the inscription that we have here dates to the 8th century. And it talks about the Saracens, or the Arabs that attacked Nicaea and destroyed a portion of the wall. They were pushed back, and this inscription makes the statement, "The place where with divine help the insolence of the enemy was put to shame. There our Christ-loving emperors, Leo and Constantine, restored with zeal the city of Nicaea." Okay? And so there was probably a breach in this area, and these stone pieces were gathered together to mend the wall so that we have now a solid wall on the northern part of Iznik. That's it. I rushed, and I see that we still have 7 minutes before the hour. Maybe I rushed too fast, and maybe there's things that I didn't explain well enough that you might want clarification, or maybe you have other questions. Jean?
Are there temples to Apollo
It's a good question for those who are online. The question is, the proposed temple that's underwater at Nicaea, is it similar to other Apollo temples? Yeah, similar in some regards, but there's differences also. There's a lot of Apollo temples. Of course, the most famous Apollo temple is at Delphi. The Delphic Oracle is an Apollo temple. And so we similarly see a paraptal temple that's surrounded by columns that looks somewhat similar to what is proposed by Mustafa Shaheen. Now we can also go to Turkey. There are some Apollo temples in Turkey as well. There's one of them that's at near Troy. This is actually mentioned in the Iliad. So it's called the Temple of Apollo of the Mice, translated. Okay, and so we don't know exactly why it's. They believe perhaps that there was a plague by mice, and prayers to Apollo caused the plague to stop. So there's a temple there. Again, it's a paraptal temple similar to what is proposed by Mustafa Shaheen. And there's others. So it's not atypical. It's similar to this. Now the problem with, there's many issues that I have with this being a temple of Apollo, as I've already mentioned. But there's only one text that even mentions an Apollo temple. And that is a text that's dated to the 8th century. It's called the Chronicon Pascal, okay? And it tells us that there was a temple of Apollo in the vicinity of Nicaea. It doesn't tell us if it was north, if it was, east, if it was south. It doesn't tell us if it was in the city or outside of the city. And there's nothing else. There's no evidence from any other ancient literary source about a temple in Nicaea. So that's kind of peculiar, and I would even question whether or not the Chronicon Pascal, which was written 5 centuries later, because this temple was originally built according to what the Pascal tells us is in the 2nd century. I think that I question whether or not there was a Apollo temple there. I've never been in an earthquake in Turkey, although I've been in 2 earthquakes here in the States. One of them was when Darlene and I were at seminary in Kentucky, and then another one was our early years here in Huntington, but never in Turkey. Now, I might mention that there was a 7.0 earthquake that had taken place in Van, in eastern part of Turkey, that occurred a month after I departed. In the hotel in which I stayed collapsed. So praise the Lord that I wasn't there at that time. But I've never felt an earthquake while I've been in Turkey.
So the edict in Milan was, you said 318?
313.
313.
Mm-hmm.
Within the Roman Empire and everything, where was the pagan worship? Like, when did that start to fade? And how much overlap was there around that period of time with the
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was, at what time did pagan worship fade away or stop? So the Edict of Milan in 313 AD did not ban pagan worship. Okay, pagan worship continued all the way up until the 6th century at least. Okay, even when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, that is in 380 AD. Okay, pagan worship did not stop at that time. Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, but pagan worship continued alongside of Christianity. Later on, there were several edicts issued by later Christian Roman emperors that banned pagan worship. But we'll notice that in the years thereafter, those edicts were issued again and again, which tells you that people weren't obeying those edicts. In other words, it's kind of like one of these situations where you've got a law, but people aren't obeying the law, and the local officials aren't doing anything to stop it. So the bottom line is, it depends on region, because it all didn't happen across the Roman Empire at the same time. But we know that pagan worship continued at least up until the 6th century. And that's why I say, even at the time when, let's say it's Neophutos, the martyrdoms stopped at 313 AD. According to the tradition that Mustafa Shaheen supports, Neophutos was executed in 303 AD, 10 years before the Edict of Milan. Okay? If that's Neophutos' shrine, that could have been erected in the years prior to the Edict of Milan. And then after the Edict of Milan, we know that churches were built in short order. Within 3 years, within 5 years, within 10 years, churches were sprouting up all across Anatolia and the empire. Okay? And that's when I think the congregation at Nicaea built a wooden church. And at what time, I don't know. Okay? But it then included and was built out and around the shrine that existed earlier. As a wooden church, and as a small wooden church, I think the church was probably enlarged with the masonry structure, just as we've seen with many, many other churches that were rebuilt and enlarged. That took place in the latter part of the 4th century. The masonry church was not the place where the Council of Nicaea met, but I do believe that the wooden church that existed earlier was the place where they began.
What's the country of origin of Mustafa Shaheen?
He's a Turk.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did he get the rights to check all this out?
Oh, he is supremely qualified to do so. Okay, he's got a PhD. He established an institute of underwater archaeology at Konya University to begin with. That's where he started out his career. And then he was hired at Bursa, which is a bigger, more prestigious university. And he established the Department of Archaeology there. He knows what he's doing. And the archaeological work that he's done there is excellent. It's just that his dating, I can't see how he can date that blue structure later than the structures that are on top. I see what has happened is, and just to take you back, okay, he was assigned to the task in 1215. And he discovered this text in the Chronicon of Pascal, and he wants to discover where the Temple of Apollo is. And so I think he made an assumption. That assumption then he transferred over to some popular publications that were made. I've got copies of some of them. They're not academic publications, but popular publications where he's speculating this could be the long lost Temple of Apollo. Well, he repeated that in later productions or later publications, and then also in academic publications. And I think his hope was that he would find a crepidoma, that he would find artifacts that can be positively identified as parts of the Apollo. It's never happened. Okay, he's been excavating there for 9 years, and it's never happened. And I think what has happened is he's painted himself into a corner. Now, Charlie, can we turn the audio off or the tape off? Yeah. You done? Okay. I don't want this to be recorded. Yeah, most of them are bronze. I couldn't go through the 871 of them and say they're all bronze, but I would get most of the coins would have been bronze. They probably have some silver there. I'm not aware. Just to remind you once again, we won't meet next week, but the week after, I'll be back. And Jason and I have talked about the dates when we can meet again. And there's going to be 2 more dates when we can meet, because he doesn't want, there's going to be, what is it, the jam? Jingle Jam. That's on one of those Sundays, which you can't have it jingling here and me doing a presentation at the same time. So we're going to have to vacate that day. But there's going to be 2 other dates, not next week, but the week after. And then I think we skip a date after the Jingle Jam, and I think I'll do another date after that. So we'll see you then. Thanks for coming.